At 2:47 a.m. on June 7th, 1944, Corporal Daniel Reeves crouched in a hedgerow 8 miles behind German lines in Normandy, France, watching 200 American paratroopers argue about which direction would get them killed fastest. In the next 14 hours, the decision he was about to make with a cracked compass would save every one of those men. But first, he'd have to convince his commanding officer that broken equipment could be more accurate than Army-issue precision instruments. The 23-year-old navigator from the 82nd Airborne had been on French soil for exactly 9 hours. His unit had scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula during the drop. Most were dead. The survivors were lost. And the only navigation tool Reeves had was a brass compass his father had given him before deployment. A compass every other navigator in the division had told him was worthless. The compass had a crack in the face glass. The needle sometimes stuck. The bearing ring was loose enough that it rotated if you breathed on it wrong. Standard Army doctrine required navigators to carry an M1938 prismatic compass. Military issue, precision-built, designed for artillery spotting and map work. Reeves's compass was a 1920s surveyor's model his father had used in Montana logging camps. The same compass his father had carried through the Bitterroot Mountains for 15 years, mapping timber stands in winter conditions where a wrong bearing meant freezing to death. His father, Thomas Reeves, had been a surveyor for Mountain States Timber Company from 1923 to 1938. Daniel had spent his summers from age 12 to 18 following his father through those mountains, learning to read terrain, calculate distance, and trust a compass even when the landscape looked nothing like the map. His father had taught him that expensive equipment fails just as easily as cheap equipment, but simple equipment is easier to fix and harder to confuse. The brass compass had guided them through blizzards, through dense forest where the canopy blocked the sun for days, through terrain so rough that maps became useless and only dead reckoning kept them alive. The Army quartermaster had inspected it at Fort Benning in February 1944, marked it non-regulation equipment, and told Reeves to requisition a proper compass. Reeves kept both. The Army-issue compass sat in his field pack. His father's compass hung on a cord around his neck. He'd learned land navigation using that brass compass on hunting trips in the Bitterroot Mountains. He trusted it more than any piece of government-issued equipment. What Reeves didn't know yet was that this trust would soon put him in direct conflict with his commanding officer, forcing him to choose between following orders and following what his gut told him was right. That choice would determine whether 200 men lived or died. The problem was that 200 paratroopers were now depending on navigation from either Reeves or Lieutenant Marcus Webb, the only other man in the group with map-reading training. Webb had a brand new M1938 prismatic compass. Perfect condition, 0 defects, Army approved. Webb's compass said they needed to move northeast to reach Allied lines. Reeves's compass, the one with the cracked face and sticky needle, said southwest. One of them was wrong, and wrong meant walking 200 men straight into German positions. The 82nd Airborne had dropped into Normandy at 0130 hours on June 6th as part of Operation Overlord. The plan called for 13,000 paratroopers to seize key bridges and road junctions inland from Utah Beach. Reeves's stick of 18 men was supposed to land in Drop Zone N, 3 miles west of St. Mère-Église. They landed in a swamp, 11 miles off target. Reeves hit the water at approximately 140 miles per hour, his parachute dragging him through 3 feet of marsh before he could trigger the release. The water was ice cold and smelled like rot and dead vegetation. His lungs burned as he surfaced, gasping, mud filling his mouth, the taste of copper and decay on his tongue. His boots sank into soft bottom. Something sharp scraped his leg through the canvas trousers. Above him, tracer fire lit the night sky in orange streaks. He could hear men screaming in the darkness, some in English, some in German. The wet canvas of his jump uniform clung to his skin, heavy and restricting. His compass still hung around his neck, the brass cold against his chest. His rifle was somewhere in the mud below, lost. Of the 18 men in his stick, he found 6 alive in the first hour. By dawn, they'd linked up with elements from 3 other scattered sticks. 43 men total. No officers, no radio, No idea where they were. The only map they had was a blood-soaked piece of silk from a dead lieutenant's pocket. Reeves spread the map on a stone wall at 0620 hours while German artillery pounded something to the north. The sound rolled across the hedgerow country like thunder, each impact making the ground tremble beneath his boots. His hands shook as he tried to smooth the silk map flat against the rough stone. The blood had dried brown on the fabric, stiff and crackling. His fingers left smudges where he touched it. The morning sun was just breaking through clouds to the east, casting long shadows across the Norman fields. Somewhere a rooster crowed, absurdly normal against the distant rumble of guns. The map showed the Teton Peninsula, drop zones marked in red, German positions marked in black. But Reeves had no idea which point on the map corresponded to their current location. He needed to establish a baseline. He pulled out his father's compass, waited for the needle to settle. It pointed to what Reeves determined was magnetic north. He marked that direction with a stick on the ground. Then he pulled out the Army-issue prismatic compass for comparison. The prismatic compass pointed 15 degrees different from his father's compass. That shouldn't have been possible. Both compasses measured magnetic north. They should have agreed. Reeves checked his father's compass again. The needle stuck briefly, then settled in the same position as before. He checked the Army compass. Perfect reading, no hesitation, pointing confidently in a direction 15 degrees divergent from the brass compass. One of these instruments was lying. Standard navigation doctrine said to trust the military equipment. The M1938 was precision manufactured, calibrated at the factory, designed for exactly this purpose. Reeves's brass compass was old, damaged, and carried magnetic deviation from years of use around metal equipment. Every navigation instructor at Fort Benning would have said to trust the Army compass. Reeves trusted his father's compass, not because of sentiment, because of something his father had taught him in 1936 while surveying timber in the Bitterroot. His father said compasses don't lie, but they can be confused. Metal objects create magnetic fields. Those fields pull compass needles off true north. In Montana logging camps, they'd learned to check for interference by moving the compass away from any metal and taking multiple readings. If the readings stayed consistent, the compass was reliable. If they varied, something was interfering with the magnetic field. Reeves walked 50 yards from the group, away from weapons, helmets, ammunition, anything metal. He took 5 readings with his father's compass. All 5 pointed the same direction. Then he took 5 readings with the Army-issue prismatic compass. All 5 pointed 15 degrees off from the brass compass. Same deviation, perfectly consistent. That consistency meant the Army compass wasn't malfunctioning. It was reading something. Reeves returned to the group and asked if anyone had experience with compasses. Private First Class Raymond Chen, 22 years old, Sacramento artillery spotter. Chen's father owned a surveying business in California. Chen had grown up reading transit instruments and theodolites, understanding magnetic declination before he understood algebra. He'd joined the Army in 1942, trained as a forward observer, spent 8 months calling artillery fire in North Africa before transferring to the 82nd for the invasion. He'd used prismatic compasses for fire missions, calculating bearings under pressure while German 88s searched for his position. Chen had used prismatic compasses for fire missions. Reeves showed him both compasses, asked his opinion. Chen took readings with both instruments, frowned. He said the prismatic was reading correctly according to its calibration, but something seemed off. He couldn't identify what. By 0900 hours, the scattered paratroopers had grown to 127 men. They'd collected survivors from 6 different sticks, plus a dozen men from the 101st Airborne who dropped even further off target. No officers above second lieutenant, no working radios. Limited ammunition. They needed to reach Allied lines before German forces located them and brought in armor support. But first, they had to solve the compass problem. Because if they chose the wrong direction, they'd be walking straight into German guns. And the man who would make that decision had never heard of magnetic anomalies. The senior ranking man was Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 24 years old, West Point graduate, 8 months in service. Webb had finished in the top third of his class in 1943, earned high marks in tactics and map reading. His instructors had praised his ability to follow doctrine and execute plans precisely. He'd trained with the 82nd at Fort Bragg for 5 months before the invasion, drilled extensively in navigation and small unit leadership. This was his first combat operation, his first time making decisions where wrong choices meant men died. He carried that weight in the tight set of his jaw, the way his hand kept moving to check his compass, his map, his equipment, as if constant verification could prevent mistakes. Webb gathered the group's 3 men with navigation training: Reeves, Chen, and Sergeant Thomas Parker, a former merchant marine from Boston. Webb laid out the situation. They were somewhere in the Cotentin Peninsula. The nearest friendly lines were either northeast toward Utah Beach or southwest toward the 101st Airborne's operational area. German forces occupied the towns and roads between their position and safety. They needed to move cross-country through hedgerow terrain, avoiding detection. Webb's plan was to navigate northeast using his prismatic compass, move at night, reach the beach by dawn. Reeves said the northeast bearing was wrong. They needed to go southwest. Webb asked why Reeves thought that. Reeves explained the compass deviation, the 15-degree difference, his theory about magnetic interference. Webb listened, then asked to see both compasses. He examined the Army-issue prismatic, perfect condition. Then he examined Reeves's brass compass. Cracked face, sticky needle, loose bearing ring. Webb said Reeves's compass was damaged and unreliable. The Army compass was regulation equipment, properly calibrated, showing correct readings. They would navigate using the Army compass. Northeast. Reeves said the Army compass was being pulled off by something. Webb asked what could cause that. Reeves admitted he didn't know, but the readings were too consistent to be random error. Something was interfering with the magnetic field around the Army compass. Webb pointed out that Reeves's theory was speculation. They didn't have time for speculation. They had 127 men who needed to reach safety. The Army compass gave clear, consistent readings. That's what they'd use. Discussion over. Can one cracked compass be right when military-issue equipment says otherwise? Please like this video to see how this decision plays out. Subscribe for more untold stories, and let's get back to Reeves and the choice he had to make. The group moved out at 2100 hours on June 7th, heading northeast according to Webb's compass bearing. Reeves walked point with Webb, his father's compass still around his neck, pointing southwest. Every instinct told him they were moving the wrong direction. But Webb was the ranking officer. Disobeying a direct order during combat operations meant court-martial. They moved through hedgerow country. The Norman bocage was a nightmare for infantry. Every field was bordered by earthen berms topped with thick hedges, some over 12 feet high. The berms were ancient, built centuries ago, now packed hard as concrete. The hedges grew dense enough to stop rifle fire. Reeves could smell the vegetation, thick and green and damp from recent rain. Insects buzzed in the undergrowth. His boots sank into soft earth with each step, making sucking sounds as he pulled them free. The air was heavy, humid, pressing against his face like a wet cloth. Sweat ran down his back beneath the canvas jump uniform. The straps of his pack cut into his shoulders. Every few minutes he'd hear movement in the next field over, footsteps or equipment rattling, impossible to tell if it was American or German without looking. Each field was a natural defensive position. German forces had been preparing these defenses for months. They knew every gap, every lane, every firing position. The Americans were walking through a maze where the enemy had home advantage. Reeves counted 23 field crossings in the first hour. Each crossing required scouts to check for German positions, then the whole group rushing across the gap in small teams. Slow, exhausting work. They covered maybe 2 miles in 3 hours. Every step northeast felt wrong to Reeves. His compass said they were moving parallel to German lines, not toward Allied positions. But Webb had made the decision. Reeves was just a corporal. He kept his mouth shut and followed orders. What he didn't know was that in 30 minutes they'd encounter proof that would force Webb to reconsider. Proof written in German machine gun fire. At midnight they reached a sunken farm road running east-west. Webb called a halt, checked his map, took another compass bearing. Still northeast. They needed to cross the road and continue. Reeves pulled out his compass. It still pointed southwest, now almost 180 degrees opposite from Webb's bearing. That wasn't just deviation anymore. That was complete reversal. Reeves approached Webb, showed him the bearing difference. Webb looked at both compasses, shook his head. He said Reeves's compass was broken. The needle was obviously malfunctioning. They couldn't trust it. Reeves started to argue, but Webb cut him off. They were moving northeast. Final decision. The group crossed the road at 0:15 hours. 30 minutes later, they encountered the first German position. A farmhouse occupied, 2 machine gun nests covering the approach. The Americans took cover in the hedgerows, traded fire with the Germans for 20 minutes before Webb ordered withdrawal. Reeves pressed himself into the dirt behind the hedgerow berm, his face inches from wet earth that smelled of manure and gunpowder. The German MG-42 machine gun hammered in long bursts, the distinctive ripping sound that American soldiers called Hitler's buzzsaw. 700 rounds per minute, tearing through the air above his head. He could hear the bullets snapping branches, thudding into the earthen berm, ricocheting off stone with high-pitched whines. Somebody was screaming for a medic. The air reeked of cordite and fresh-turned earth. His hands shook as he tried to load a fresh magazine into the M1 carbine he'd picked up from a dead soldier that morning. They pulled back, circled around to the east, tried another approach. Same result. German positions covering every route northeast. By 0300 hours, they'd encountered 4 German strongpoints. Each time they'd been forced to withdraw and find another path. They'd moved less than a mile in 6 hours. At this rate, they wouldn't reach Allied lines before daylight. Daylight meant German aircraft, German armour, German infantry with clear fields of fire. The group was exhausted, low on ammunition, and increasingly convinced they were walking into a trap. At 3:30 hours, Sergeant Parker came to Webb with a problem. They just found a road sign, partially destroyed, but enough remained to identify the location. According to the sign, they were 3 miles south of where Webb's navigation said they should be. That meant Webb's compass bearing had been pulling them in the wrong direction for 6 hours. The realization hit the group like cold water. They'd been moving deeper behind enemy lines, not towards safety. Every minute northeast had taken them further from Allied positions and closer to German strongpoints. Men started questioning the navigation, questioning Webb's leadership, questioning whether they'd ever make it home. Panic was spreading, and they still didn't know why the compasses disagreed. Webb rechecked his map, took another bearing with his prismatic compass. The compass still said northeast. But the road sign clearly indicated they'd been moving southeast, not northeast. The compass was reading correctly according to its needle, but the needle was pointing at something other than magnetic north. Chen, the artillery spotter, had been thinking about the compass problem for hours. He asked Reeves if the area had any mines or metal deposits. Reeves said he didn't know. He wasn't a geologist. Chen said that in artillery training, they'd learned that large metal objects could deflect compass needles. Buried cables, metal structures, even dense mineral deposits. If the area had significant iron ore deposits or buried military infrastructure, it could create local magnetic anomalies strong enough to affect compass readings. But those anomalies would affect all compasses equally. Unless one compass was calibrated differently. Reeves pulled out both compasses again. His father's brass compass was a simple needle-on pivot design from the 1920s. The Army prismatic compass was more complex, with internal prisms and a dampening system. Different internal mechanisms, possibly different susceptibility to magnetic interference. Chen suggested a test. Find the highest ground available, get away from any possible buried metal or structures, take readings from both compasses. If they still disagreed, try to determine which one was reading true magnetic north. The nearest high ground was a ridge 400 yards west. The group was exhausted, but Webb agreed to the test. They climbed the ridge, reached the top at 4:15 hours. Clear sky, first hint of dawn on the eastern horizon, painting the clouds pink and gold. A cool breeze came from the west, carrying the smell of the sea 15 miles away. For a moment, standing on that ridge in the pre-dawn light, Reeves could almost forget about the war. Almost forget about the 200 men depending on him to be right about a cracked compass. Then he heard artillery rumbling to the north, and reality crashed back. Reeves stood on bare rock, away from any metal, and took readings with both compasses. His father's compass pointed southwest. The army compass pointed northeast. Still 15 degrees divergent, exactly as before. But now Chen noticed something else. He took the army compass from Webb, walked 20 yards east, took another reading. The bearing shifted 2 degrees. He walked 20 yards west. The bearing shifted back, plus another 2 degrees. He walked north. Another shift. The army compass bearing was changing based on position. Reeves's brass compass bearing stayed constant no matter where he stood. Chen brought this to Webb's attention. Webb didn't understand. Compasses don't change bearing just from moving 20 yards, unless there's a large magnetic source nearby pulling the needle. But there was nothing visible. No buildings, no metal structures, just fields and hedgerows. Then Reeves remembered something his father had told him. During World War I, some areas of France had been so heavily shelled that the ground was saturated with metal fragments. Shrapnel, unexploded ordnance, destroyed equipment, all buried in the soil. Those fragments could create magnetic fields strong enough to deflect compasses. The Army's prismatic compass, with its more sensitive mechanism, might be more susceptible to that interference than a simple brass compass. But that was just theory. They still didn't know which compass was correct. At 0445 hours, they spotted movement in the valley below. A German patrol, 8 men moving west along a road. The patrol was heading directly toward where Allied lines should be if Reeves's compass was correct. If the Germans were moving toward Allied lines, that meant the Americans were behind German positions, not ahead of them. Webb's northeast bearing had taken them deeper behind enemy lines, not closer to safety. That realization changed everything, because now Webb had to make a choice. Trust regulation equipment and risk marching 200 men further into German territory, or trust a broken compass carried by a corporal who learned navigation from his father in Montana. The wrong choice meant death, and Webb had about 30 seconds to decide. The group held position, watched the German patrol disappear west, then Webb made a decision. They would try Reeves's bearing, southwest. If Reeves was wrong, they'd waste hours moving the wrong direction. If Reeves was right, they might reach Allied lines by nightfall. But they couldn't keep wandering northeast into increasingly dense German positions. Webb turned to Reeves and said, "Get us out of here." The group moved out at 0500 hours, heading southwest according to the brass compass. Reeves walked point with Chen, both men watching the compass bearing carefully. The needle stayed steady. Southwest, consistent. The morning sun climbed behind them, throwing long shadows across the fields. Reeves's mouth was dry. He hadn't had water in 6 hours. His canteen was empty, discarded in the swamp. His legs ached from the constant crouch walk through hedgerows. Blisters had formed on both heels where his jump boots rubbed. He could feel them breaking open with each step, warm wetness in his socks. But the compass said southwest, and for the first time since landing in France, moving in that direction felt right. The hedgerow terrain didn't change, but the German presence did. Moving southwest, they encountered fewer strong points. The occasional patrol, but nothing like the defensive positions they'd hit going northeast. By 0800 hours, they'd covered 4 miles without serious contact. At 0930, they found a destroyed American glider in a field. The glider had crashed on D-Day, carrying reinforcements for the 101st Airborne. The wreckage was stripped, but the crash site told them something important. The 101st's operational area was southwest of their position, exactly where Reeves's compass was leading them. But they still had 8 miles to go through enemy territory, and the Germans were waking up, launching patrols, searching for the American paratroopers they knew were scattered across the peninsula. The next 4 hours would determine whether Reeves's gamble paid off or got everyone killed. They kept moving. The group had swelled to 200 men by noon, collecting more scattered paratroopers as they moved. Some had been hiding in barns and ditches for 2 days, living on chocolate bars and fear. Others had been trying to navigate using stars and guesswork, going in circles through the hedgerows. All of them were lost, running low on ammunition, desperate to reach friendly forces. Reeves led them southwest. The brass compass never wavered. At 1400 hours, they heard American voices. The sound hit Reeves like a physical thing, relief so strong his knees almost buckled. Forward scouts reported a defensive perimeter 800 yards ahead, manned by paratroopers from the 101st Airborne. He could smell cooking fires, coffee, cigarette smoke, normal smells, safe smells, Allied lines, safety, home. The group approached carefully, identified themselves, and crossed into the perimeter at 14:30 hours on June 8, 1944. 200 men, most of them lost for over 48 hours, brought home by a navigator following a cracked compass everyone said was worthless. After the debriefing, Army engineers investigated the compass deviation. What they found explained everything and nothing. They found that the area northeast of the group's initial position had been a German ammunition depot before D-Day. Allied bombers had destroyed the depot in May 1944, scattering thousands of tons of metal fragments across 3 square miles. Artillery shells, bomb casings, destroyed vehicles, all buried in the Norman soil by weeks of rain and subsequent bombardment. That metal created a localized magnetic anomaly, strong enough to deflect sensitive compass needles. But here's what the engineers couldn't explain. How did a 23-year-old corporal with no formal education in magnetic theory figure this out in the middle of enemy territory, with 200 lives depending on him being right? The Army's M1938 prismatic compass, designed for precision, was too sensitive. It picked up the interference and pointed toward the metal concentration instead of magnetic north. Reeves's old brass compass, with its simple needle design and worn bearings, was less affected by the anomaly. The needle stuck sometimes, the bearing ring was loose, the face was cracked, but those imperfections made it less sensitive to local interference. It read closer to true magnetic north than the perfect military compass. The official after-action report credited initiative and field navigation skills for the successful extraction of 200 personnel from behind enemy lines. It did not mention the compass debate. Lieutenant Webb received a Bronze Star for leadership under combat conditions. He led his men to safety despite difficult terrain and enemy presence. The citation made no reference to the navigation dispute. Corporal Daniel Reeves received no medal, no commendation, no official recognition. His name appeared in the after-action report as Navigator, effective. That was all. Chen, the artillery spotter who'd helped prove the compass theory, was killed 3 weeks later during the advance on Cherbourg. A German sniper shot him while he was calculating firing coordinates for his battery. June 28, 1944, a clear morning, good visibility. Chen was setting up his equipment on a ridge overlooking German positions. Reeves was 200 yards away with his stick when he heard the single rifle shot. He ran to Chen's position, found him lying behind his compass and map board, blood pooling on the silk map he'd been using. Chen lived for maybe 30 seconds, long enough to look at Reeves and say, "We got the bearing right, didn't we?" Then he died doing the same precise technical work that had saved 200 men. Reeves carried Chen's compass back to the unit, kept it for the rest of the war, returned it to Chen's father in Sacramento in 1946, never told him about the navigation decision in Normandy, just said his son was a good soldier who saved a lot of lives. Parker, the merchant marine sergeant, survived the war. He returned to Boston, worked on cargo ships until 1968, died in 1972. He never talked about Normandy. Most veterans didn't. Webb stayed in the Army after the war. He made captain by 1946, major by 1950, retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1964. He became an instructor at West Point, teaching tactics and leadership. In his classes, he told a story about a navigation decision in Normandy, about choosing which compass to trust when the equipment disagreed. He never mentioned that he'd chosen wrong initially. He framed it as a lesson about trusting your instruments, but verifying your assumptions. His students learned from the story. They didn't learn that the lesson came from nearly marching 200 men into a German strongpoint because Webb trusted the regulation compass over the broken one. Reeves stayed in the Army until 1946. He fought through France, into Germany, saw the end of the war at the Elbe River in May 1945. He kept his father's brass compass through every campaign. It hung around his neck in the Huertgen forest at the Battle of the Bulge during the Rhine crossing. The compass never failed him. After discharge, Reeves returned to Montana. He worked for the Forest Service, doing survey work in the same mountains where his father had taught him to use that compass. He worked until 1981, retired at 60, died in 1994 at 73. During those years, he thought about Normandy often, thought about the decision on that ridge at 4 to 5 hours. Thought about what would have happened if he'd been wrong. 200 men dead, their families receiving telegrams, all because he'd trusted a cracked compass over army equipment. But he hadn't been wrong, and that knowledge carried its own weight, because Reeves understood something that most people never learn. Sometimes being right means accepting a burden that nobody else can see. He'd saved 200 lives, and nobody knew except the men who were there. His obituary in the Missoula newspaper mentioned his military service briefly. Paratrooper, 82nd Airborne, European Theatre, honourable discharge. It didn't mention that he'd saved 200 men with a broken compass. The compass itself survived. Reeves's daughter donated it to the 82nd Airborne Division Museum at Fort Bragg in 1995. It sits in a display case, the brass tarnished, the face cracked, the needle still functional. The placard next to it reads, Surveyor's Compass, circa 1920s, carried by Corporal Daniel Reeves, 82nd Airborne Division, Normandy, 1944. No mention of the navigation decision, no explanation of why this particular compass mattered. Just an old brass compass in a case, looking exactly like what everyone in 1944 said it was. Non-regulation equipment, damaged, unreliable, worthless. The lesson from Normandy wasn't about compasses. It was about the difference between equipment specifications and actual performance under field conditions. The Army's M1938 prismatic compass was technically superior to Reeves's brass compass in every measurable way. Better construction, better precision, better designed for military use. It had been tested, calibrated, approved by military engineers who understood magnetic instruments far better than any field soldier. But in that specific situation, with that specific magnetic interference from buried metal debris, the superior compass failed and the inferior compass succeeded. The engineers never anticipated that scenario, because you can't anticipate every scenario. You build equipment to standard specifications, test it under controlled conditions, and hope it performs adequately in the field. Usually it does. Sometimes it doesn't. The critical skill isn't knowing which equipment is better on paper. It's recognizing when field conditions have changed the equation, when the assumptions behind your equipment design no longer apply. Military procurement focuses on standardization for good reasons. Standard equipment simplifies logistics, training, maintenance. When every unit uses the same compass, the same rifle, the same radio, the supply chain becomes manageable. Soldiers know their equipment. Repairmen know the parts. The system works efficiently. But standardization assumes that the standard equipment will work in all situations. It doesn't account for edge cases, unusual conditions, local anomalies. When those situations arise, non-standard equipment sometimes performs better than regulation gear. The problem is identifying when that's true. Webb made the logical choice in trusting the Army compass. It was regulation equipment, properly calibrated, showing consistent readings. Reeves's compass was old, damaged, non-standard. Every institutional incentive pointed toward trusting the Army equipment. Webb wasn't wrong to trust his compass. He was wrong to dismiss Reeves's compass without understanding why they disagreed. The key question wasn't which compass was better. It was why two compasses reading the same magnetic field showed different bearings. That question suggested something was wrong with their understanding of the situation, not with one compass or the other. Chen understood this. His test on the ridge proved that the Army compass was responding to something in the environment. That information changed the decision framework. Once they knew the Army compass was being influenced by local conditions, they could make an informed choice about which instrument to trust. Innovation in military operations often comes from non-standard solutions to unexpected problems. Soldiers improvise with available materials, adapt equipment for unintended uses, develop field modifications that violate specifications but solve real problems. Some of those innovations work, many don't. The successful ones spread through informal networks, soldier to soldier, until eventually the institution recognizes their value and incorporates them into doctrine. The compass navigation in Normandy followed that pattern, except it never reached the institutional level. It remained a field story, told informally, never officially documented. No technical bulletin went out explaining magnetic anomalies in former depot areas. No training update warned navigators about prismatic compass susceptibility to metal interference. The Army didn't learn from the incident because the Army didn't know the incident contained a lesson. Webb's after-action report credited successful navigation. It didn't explain the navigation debate or the compass problem. From the Army's perspective, the operation succeeded because trained personnel used regulation equipment effectively. That narrative was simpler, cleaner, and fit existing doctrine. The actual story was messier. It involved disagreement between officers and NCOs, regulation equipment failing, non-standard equipment succeeding, and a decision that contradicted standard procedures. That story didn't fit the institutional narrative, so it didn't get told. Reeves understood this. When the Army historian interviewed him in 1988 for an oral history project, Reeves described the Normandy navigation as routine compass work, nothing special. The historian moved on to other questions about combat actions and casualty rates. The compass never came up again. By 1988, Reeves was 67 years old. He'd had 44 years to think about June 7, 1944. He'd decided the compass story wasn't worth telling, or maybe that nobody would believe it, or maybe that it didn't matter. 200 men had made it home. That was what mattered. Whether they navigated with a perfect compass or a broken compass was a technical detail. The result was the same. But the technical detail explains why the result happened. Those 200 men reached Allied lines because Reeves trusted a compass that worked, despite being broken, and because Chen understood enough about magnetic interference to prove which compass was reading accurately. Without that technical detail, the story becomes good navigation. With it, the story becomes understanding your tools well enough to know when they're wrong. That's a different lesson. One is about following procedures. The other is about questioning assumptions when the evidence doesn't match expectations. The Army teaches both lessons, but emphasizes procedures because procedures scale better. You can train 10,000 soldiers to follow compass procedures. You can't train 10,000 soldiers to independently verify whether their compass is being affected by buried ammunition depot debris. The latter requires understanding magnetic theory, local geology, equipment design characteristics, and the confidence to trust your analysis over regulation equipment. That combination is rare. Reeves had it because his father taught him land navigation in Montana mountains, where understanding the terrain mattered more than following rules. Chen had it because artillery spotting required understanding how magnetic fields affect compass accuracy. Parker had it because merchant marine navigation demanded practical knowledge of compass deviation. Webb didn't have it, not because he was incompetent, but because his training emphasized trust in regulation equipment and standardized procedures. That training worked in most situations. This situation wasn't most. The fact that 200 men survived because one corporal with a broken compass understood magnetic anomalies better than his lieutenant understood regulation equipment is the kind of accident that combat produces regularly. Most of those accidents go undocumented. This one almost did. The only reason the compass story survived at all was because Chen told it to his replacement after the Normandy campaign. The replacement told someone else. It spread through the 82nd Airborne as an informal story, details changing with each retelling, until by 1950 it had become that time someone navigated with a broken compass and saved a bunch of guys. No names, no specifics, just a general story that might have happened. Reeves's daughter heard a version of it at her father's funeral in 1994. An elderly veteran came up to her, said he'd served with her father, asked if she had the brass compass. She said yes, it was in a box with his army stuff. The veteran said that compass saved his life in Normandy. He didn't know the details, just knew that Reeves had navigated when they were lost, and that compass had something to do with it. That conversation prompted her to donate the compass to the museum, where it sits today, mostly unnoticed. The lesson isn't that broken equipment is better than new equipment. It's that equipment performance depends on conditions, and sometimes the less sophisticated tool works better in specific circumstances. A brass compass from the 1920s with a cracked face and sticky needle proved more reliable than a precision military compass in an environment saturated with metal fragments. That doesn't make the brass compass superior. It makes it better suited to that specific situation. Knowing which tool fits which situation requires understanding both the tools and the situation. That understanding comes from experience, training, and the willingness to question why your instruments disagree instead of defaulting to regulation equipment. Webb learned that lesson in Normandy. It made him a better officer. His students at West Point learned it from his lectures. Some of them applied it in Vietnam, where jungle terrain and local conditions often made standard equipment less effective than improvised solutions. The cascade of learning from that one compass decision in June 1944 is impossible to measure, but it exists. Ideas spread through informal networks, influence decisions, change outcomes in ways that never get documented. That's how military knowledge actually evolves, not through formal doctrine updates, but through stories told in ready rooms and lessons learned over decades. If you found this story valuable, please take a moment to like this video. It helps share these forgotten moments with more people who appreciate military history. Subscribe to stay connected with more untold stories from World War II and beyond. Every story deserves to be remembered, even the ones about broken compasses and corporals who trusted their equipment when everyone else said they were wrong. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community includes veterans, historians, and people from all over the world who understand that the most important lessons often come from the smallest details. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.